Good afternoon. My name is Margarita Caulfield. I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, and I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's program. On behalf of the Dole Institute, I have 3 requests. First, please turn off your cell phones. Secondly, we will have a Q&A session immediately after the program. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a staffer to bring you the microphone. Finally, do please ask a single question. Our director doesn't tolerate filibustering during questions. It is my honor to introduce Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Thank all of you for coming out today. I see a lot of new faces, so we're delighted to have you here at the Dole Institute of Politics. As Margarita said, I'm Bill Lacey. I'm the director here. I want to make a couple of brief announcements. First of all, you might want to look at the back of your program if you have a chance, or when you take it home, look at the back of it. You'll see some upcoming programs. We have a program next Monday night, which will be especially fascinating. It's on the concept of the national popular vote. As we do typically at the Dole Institute, we'll have both a pro and a con side represented, and that will be a very interesting discussion. So if you're interested in that, we hope that you'll think about coming out. I would also tell you that we will have copies available of Bryan's book, which you may purchase today from the KU bookstore. It's right out here. I'm sure all of you will want to purchase at least 4 or 5 copies for gifts and have Bryan sign them for you. And I'm sure he would be delighted to sit out there and sign until he goes through all of them. 3 years ago, the Dole Institute stumbled across an extraordinary resource just down the road in Topeka. We were organizing a discussion of media coverage of the 2008 presidential campaign, and someone suggested a fellow serve on a panel. His name was David Chimke. He was the editor of the Utne Reader. David impressed the heck out of me, and I got to meet a number of folks from Utne's parent corporation, Ogden Publications. As we learned about Ogden, its publications and objectives, it quickly became clear that there were many program opportunities available there to the Dole Institute. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. When he's not farming his 50 acres, Bryan Welch runs Ogden Publications. His company has grown rapidly over the past few years and now publishes 10 magazines for people interested in self-sufficiency, sustainability, rural lifestyles, and farm collectibles. Titles include Mother Earth News and Utne Reader, among others. Ogden also publishes books and markets insurance and financial services to its subscribers, and provides companies of all sizes with strategic consulting services on marketing to the green-focused consumer. About 1/3 of its gross revenue comes from these ancillary marketing programs. Before beginning Ogden in 1996, Bryan spent 19 years as a reporter, photographer, editor, and publisher of newspapers. He holds a master's degree from Harvard University, where he studied media policy and media management at the Kennedy School of Government and Harvard Business School. Bryan is here today to discuss his book, Beautiful and Abundant. Please welcome Bryan Welch to the Dole Institute.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming. It's an uncanny match between the number of people who are here and the number of chairs. It never works out this well. I think that's fantastic. It's really a pleasure for me to be talking in the town where Carol and I have made our home for the past, 15 or 16 years, right? And it's really fun. I've talked about the book about 30 times this year in talks like this, and I'm not sure, but this might be the first time my wife has ever been here. Is that with me? Is that right? Is this the first time? A couple others? Well, this was going to be the best one, anyhow. I've had the privilege of spending practically my whole adult life writing and thinking about environmental issues, the issues of sustainability. It's a privilege because, in the whole universe, so far as we can tell, there's one species that can conceptualize its own impact on its habitat. So far as we know, in the whole universe, only one species can think about how it's affecting its own habitat. That one species is us. We haven't done a lot of thinking about that because we've ingeniously figured out ways of using resources more effectively, and we've expanded across the globe from one pole to the other and all the way around without really having to come to grips with any material limits on our expansion, perhaps until now, until our generation, until this point in history. So in a way, you and I have the privilege of being alive at the definitive point in human history, at the point in human history when our humanity is having its most rigorous test. And I think that's really exciting. I think it's an extraordinary privilege for us to be here now, and it implies that we're facing some pretty big challenges. Of course, over the years of thinking and writing about these things and staring all day long every day at these big obstacles we face, the environmental issues we face, I gradually started losing my native optimism and becoming preoccupied with the scale of the challenges we faced. It's been part of the vernacular of sustainability and environmentalism to talk almost exclusively about that which we should be afraid of. And frankly, I came to the realization that I wasn't going to be able to maintain my own enthusiasm if I kept staring at the obstacles. I was looking for another way of motivating myself and realized I didn't have to look a lot farther, perhaps, than Mother Earth News. Mother Earth News was founded in 1970 and has virtually ever since the month of its founding, been the largest and most successful medium focused on sustainability in the world. It's an extraordinary story. It caught a movement at the time of its founding, but of course the issues have ebbed and flowed over the years, and it hasn't always, those issues haven't always been at the forefront of people's minds. Nonetheless, Mother Earth News has stuck with us. And it leads one to ask the question, why only one, and why is it successful? I always, as a business person, like to give shareholders and others the impression that we understand why we're successful before we become successful, because that gives the impression that we knew what we were doing to begin with. I think almost always that is not true, and when something works, we go and try to figure out why it worked, so we then when we write our memoirs, we can do a good job of explaining why we saw it all to begin with. In fact, I think we needed to take a good hard look at what we'd been doing and why it was successful. And what we saw was 40 years of optimism, 40 years of forming sustainable visions in people's minds. Maybe a vision of something as simple as a garden. Maybe a vision of something as grand as an existence completely off the electric grid. But always a vision was the inspiration, and always optimism was the state of mind. With that realization came the question, so as a society then, as a species, why are we not talking about our vision for the future of our species, for the future of our world, for the future of our societies? Why hasn't there been a lot of discussion of what kind of world we want our great-grandchildren to live in? So, I decided I'd try to write a book about it. My goal in writing the book was primarily was to try to start a conversation that involved a lot of people about the kind of world that we want our great-grandchildren to live in. What I discovered in the process of writing it was a revelation and a great fringe benefit to having written it. And that was, I found as I talked in this tone of optimism, as I persisted in forming visions of a really desirable future, a beautiful and abundant future for future generations, I found my own state of mind moving in that direction. Probably because I was meditating in that frame of mind long hours every day. Well, I will say, as an aside, that the process of writing a book is not exclusively a positive-minded process. I found it to be a bipolar experience. As Carolyn will testify, she got the brunt of the bipolar disorder. The bipolar disorder being that in the morning, the brilliance with which you were writing a particular passage didn't necessarily survive till evening when you read it back to yourself. Nonetheless, I came out of the experience feeling actually very optimistic, very upbeat about the future of our species. About 1885 or so, somebody came up with the idea for the pedal-driven bicycle. Until then, you had to climb on top of a seat that was about 5 feet off the ground so that your little tiny pedal sprocket could drive this giant wheel, and that's how you got your speed. Then somebody came up with the pedal, with the chain-driven bicycle. Sorry, chain-driven. So you hooked a chain up to the sprocket, and that allowed you, that gave you all kinds of possibilities. You didn't have to climb on top of that tall thing anymore. In less than 10 years after that, people were using chain drive to drive the first automobiles with little steam engines. 1903, just a little over a decade after the first chain-driven bicycle, the Wright brothers flew over Kitty Hawk. And by 1910, just a few years after the Wright brothers, we were selling tickets on airliners flying over the Tampa Bay. Now think about that for a second. From the chain-driven bicycle to human flight in that short period of time. And then from the first glider soaring over the, well, soaring 7 or 8 feet above the dunes at Kitty Hawk, 66 years, we were going to the moon. We are the most extraordinarily inventive creatures. And in light of all that, in the context of that kind of achievement, what can we not achieve? What obstacle can we not overcome? Well, I think that this small issue of creating a sustainable, prosperous, healthy presence for ourselves on this abundant planet is perfectly within the frame of our capabilities. I think we can certainly achieve it. But, as athletes know, as business people know, as anyone knows who has achieved anything of any scale, you have to start with a vision of a spectacular outcome. I often tell people that no realistic business plan was ever funded. Every entrepreneur knows that. A perfectly realistic, reasonable business plan doesn't get anybody's attention. Your investors want you to have a vision of spectacular success. And they want to hitch their star to that vision. And everybody knows, well, the reality is going to fall somewhere short of that original vision. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea to pursue that vision. The surest way, the only way of being absolutely confident that you will not achieve the spectacular is to aim for the realistic. You have to, I think, have a vision of real beauty and abundance in the human future for us to come close to what we want to achieve. So that's what I'm recommending. In the context of politics, I think a lot of these, the political lens warps a lot of visions. It changes, it causes us, so much of our news is reported through the lens of politics that I think we often misunderstand how people feel about these issues. I frequently share my own adventures in sustainability with the guys in the locker room at Wood Valley Racquet Club over in Topeka. I work out there every noon. And if there's any doubt in your mind that we live in a conservative part of the country, I can dispel that doubt with a short recording of the conversation from the locker room at the Wood Valley Racquet Club. My pals at the Wood Valley Racquet Club are as conservative a group of guys as you ever want to meet. But when I talk about the new plug-in Prius hybrid that we're driving and how 75 miles per gallon this and completely silent that and smooth and pleasurable, I get their attention and they're keen to involve themselves in the conversation. When I talk about our new solar hot water system at the house and how it's really supplying all of our hot water year-round and we can take almost infinitely long showers if we want to, completely guilt-free. That attracts their attention. They want to hear about it. They love talking about vegetable gardening. They love talking about biodiesel for the tractor and growing your own grass-fed meat. And these guys, I'm telling you, they're not posers. They really are hard-shell conservatives. Furthermore, I operate at something of a disadvantage as a spokesperson or as a communicator in the locker room at Wood Valley, because very often I'm naked as I'm trying to communicate my excitement about these things. For some people that might be an advantage. In my case, it is not, I assure you. But I learned from these guys that everybody agrees that they want their great-grandchildren to live on a planet that's beautiful and abundant and clean and healthy and prosperous. Everybody agrees about that. And almost everybody agrees that some of the stuff that's getting invented is unbelievably cool. Everybody understands the value of efficiency. Everybody understands the value of frugality. Everybody understands the value of wilderness, really, and of having a place where other species can live abundant lives and prosper. So if we form this vision in our heads and talk about this vision a bit more, is it not logical that together we could backtrack from where we know almost all of us want to end up to the next steps we need to take now? I think we can. We do have some obstacles. The big obstacle is the one that we talk the most about, or the first obstacle, not the biggest obstacle, but one big obstacle that we talk the most about is the conservation obstacle. That's the usual stuff. Yes, we're consuming too many resources too quickly. We can't replace them fast enough. We pollute, yes. Climate change may or may not be real, may or may not be caused by human beings. Whatever you believe about that, it's a symptom of something important going on. But underlying all of that, of course, is the fact that in my lifetime, the human population has doubled on this planet. In my lifetime. Carol and I are farmers, and we know that if we have 20 head of cattle in a pasture and we double it, we better watch very closely what happens in that pasture, because pretty soon cows are hungry or diseased or worse. If we double it again, we're almost certain that we'll have some kind of catastrophe there. The simple fact of the matter is, whatever you think about human population, however you calculate the carrying capacity of the planet, the pace at which we've been expanding is unsustainable in and of itself. And every environmental problem traces back to how many people live on the planet. 85% of deforestation is carried on by subsistence farmers who are clearing land to feed their families. I don't blame them for that, not in any way, shape, or form. I would be doing the same thing if I were born into their predicament. But 85% of deforestation and 100% of desertification is caused by overpopulation in certain parts of the world and the need of people to claim land for agricultural production or grazing. Now, the population thing, well, we have some tools for dealing with it. We do have birth control. We know how to use it. The technology is there. And furthermore, we understand that if we raise the standard of living in a country to something roughly the equivalent of our own standard, of half of our own standard of living, the birth rates plummet, and the population drops, or at least stabilizes. So we do have tools for dealing with it, and if we can figure out a way of talking about it and raising our own awareness, I think that one is frankly pretty manageable, which leads to the toughest, I think, of the intermediate obstacles we face before we can really realize really create the world that we want our great-grandchildren to live in. And the toughest of them is economics. Ever since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, every period of economic growth, the whole period of economic growth since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, since modern economics was defined, all of it was driven by population growth. We've had rapid population growth every year since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Economic growth, creating economic growth is child's play when you have more customers every year. It's virtually automatic. So how do we create prosperity or distribute resources in a world where the human population is stable or declining? Imagine a world in which real estate is becoming gradually less valuable every year. Well, I guess we could do that since we've had a brief experience with that recently. But imagine that going on forever and being the expectation. Well, we don't have the economic tools to deal with stability. A couple of years ago, worldwide production contracted by 0.5%, and worldwide markets shrunk by 13%. So our financial markets shrink by 13% if you cut back production by 0.5%. That means that we really don't know how to grapple with stability. We have no idea economically how to deal with that. And so that's what I want all the young people here to study, is economics as they go to college, and because we're going to need a lot of really excellent economists in the near future. I'm going to say just a couple of more words about the obstacles, because I want to fully illustrate what keeps my attention trained on these issues and why I think getting beyond them is so important. We're losing 50 to 150 species per day. That's the rate at which diversity is declining in the planetary biology. By 2100, at the end of this century, that's the end of this century, right? Yeah. 2/3 of all the species alive in 1900 will be gone. By 2100, at current rates of decline. 2/3 of all the species. 90% of large mammals have already disappeared. 95% of large fish are gone compared to the beginning of the 20th century. 75% of the forests that stood at the beginning of the 20th century no longer exist. 30% of the arable land is gone due to either development or desertification. In the United States, where we consider our rate of expansion modest, we are building a new Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area every year. That's the rate of expansion in the U.S. population. If you've driven around Minneapolis-St. Paul, you have a sense of how many paved streets that is, how many houses, how much farmland is getting covered up, how much habitat is gone, except, of course, for squirrels and cats and, our own pets. On the other hand, if we look at what we've achieved by innovating and imagining constructively over roughly the same time period, we've gone from about 85% of the human population in 1850 lived on the equivalent of less than $1 a day. So something like 85% of the human population in 1850 was, by our standards, living in deep poverty. Today that number is about 15%, from 85 to 15% in just a couple of hundred years. At current rates of decline in that kind of severe poverty, there will be no severe poverty by 2100. And this is not social engineering so much as it is just a product of free markets. And I'm not here as an economic expert, and I'm not here as a proponent particularly of one economic system or another. But the reason poverty has shrunk is because many more people are actively engaged in the marketplace than were when the marketplace was controlled by elites who held all the control and used human beings purely as labor and didn't give them active access to the markets. So those are huge improvements in the quality of life. Also, the length of life over the past couple of hundred years has grown at an unbelievable rate, from in 1700, the average lifespan in Western Europe was between 30 and 35 years from one country to another. And today it's 82 years. I'm saying all this again to say that we are capable of achieving remarkable things in a variety of ways. And simply by employing our native ingenuity, we've made remarkable stuff happen. So in spite of the fact that I can enumerate all these big obstacles and I can describe all these reasons why we should be worried about our habitat and we should be concerned for our planet, I think there's an equal amount of evidence that we should be optimistic about our ability to deal with it, and we should be communicating with that optimism. This whole planet is kind of a miracle machine, I think. When I was 9 years old, I went to work for the neighbor. He was a guy named Tim Posey. My dad walked in. Hi, Dad. And so there's one other person here who knew Tim. Tim wasn't exactly the model of the modern environmentalist. Tim, he weighed somewhere between 250 and 300 pounds, I think. He wore prescription sunglasses that were the darkest prescription sunglasses I've ever seen. I can honestly say, in the many years I worked side by side with him, I never saw the man's pupils contracted. I never saw him without those things on outside. Now, we lived in the desert in southern New Mexico, and sunglasses is generally a pretty good idea, but Tim was never without them. But Tim had created this menagerie around his home in the Chihuahuan Desert. Goats and chickens and guinea hens, and he boarded a bunch of horses. Occasionally he had a milk cow and a calf, and a vegetable garden. One of my main job every day was milking the goats, and my dad would pay me for the milk, so I was in the cash when I was 9. It was good. I was a business person and appreciating free enterprise. And then I helped irrigate the vegetable garden. Now, southern New Mexico, it's sand hills. It's very hard to grow anything, water or no water. So Tim would have me help him scrape out the contents of the chicken houses and put them into big 55-gallon drums and then run water into the drums. And my job, because he said he had a sore back, which I always doubted, my job was leaning over with my head inside of the barrel and stirring the slurry before we poured it out with the irrigation water. That's a memorable experience. But it also stuck in my mind that then you could put a watermelon seed in a pile of sand and some chicken shit in southern New Mexico, and a couple months later eat watermelon. That struck me as kind of a miracle. And then, I'd follow these goats around out there in the desert, and they would eat bunch grass and mesquite beans and whatever they could find. And then in the evening, we'd go in, and I'd get a couple of gallons of this incredibly rich, fatty, delicious milk, which I knew had to be made from mesquite beans and bunch grass. That essential miracle is probably the key component in my inspiration for doing what I do for a living, for living my life the way I do. I think God gave us this extraordinary planet, this planet that's, as far as we know, unlike any other planet, at least any other planet we can see. And God, or the Creator, or the system, or however you want to characterize it, him, her, them, has given us a perfect illustration of the phenomenal power of biology and the miraculous capability of the planet to take sunlight and create complexity. When you look at the diversity and complexity in biology, in the living system, you get the impression that God loves diversity. That God made a system where every little niche, every lifestyle, every little patch of ice or grass or sand can be populated by something with a rich, complex life, something that's beautiful in its own way. I don't want to be a member of the species that makes it less complex, less beautiful, or less abundant. So I think what I'm going to keep doing is going around to institutes of politics or churches or locker rooms if necessary, and talking with enthusiasm and passion and zeal about my own goats and my own watermelons, and see if I can't get other people excited about preserving and restoring a truly sustainably beautiful and abundant human presence on this planet. Thanks for coming, and I'd love to have a conversation if anybody has questions or objections or anything at all. Thanks a lot. I appreciate you being here. There's always this pregnant pause then. Actually, not always. It's actually a good pregnant pause, because whenever anybody asks a question immediately upon the closing like that, you're always in for trouble. I know that for a fact. Sir?
I guess my question is he has an exam. As you were reflecting on your personal lifestyle and the kinds of things that have been altered from the kind of conventional lifestyle to lead that lifestyle, do you see the culture of a state like Kansas as having an adaptability? What is it that's really going to spring people into an adaptability mode?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, I think what's going to spring them into adaptability mode is my book. Didn't I make that clear? No, I think that it has to start with a change of mind. I'm actually very, very positive and optimistic about people's adaptability in Kansas or anywhere else. And by the way, I love to talk about living in a conservative place, and I love to talk about the locker room and everything, but when it comes right down to it, we don't live in a red or a blue country. We live in a purple country, and every zip code has its own complexion, as it were. And I don't think of Kansas as being peculiarly resistant to change. The whole country looks peculiarly resistant to change, I think sometimes for a simple reason, and that is that about 30% of the registered voters between the ages of 20 and 30 actually cast a ballot in any given election. 70% of voters between 60 and 80 cast a ballot in any given election. So if the politics of the country look like they don't exactly reflect your identities, it may be because the folks voting are not the people in your demographic. Or they might be in your demographic, and you may recognize the lens through which politics projects some of these issues. The fact is that politics, the American government, reflects the values of people who are, to a degree, much more than the average, tending to look backward rather than forward. People between their 60s and 80s find reference in the past more often than people between 20 and 30. And so I think the whole country tends to look resistant to change to a degree that it's not. When I was about 4 years old, my crazy grandfather took me to a cafe in eastern Oklahoma and talked to me. He talked to me in Spanish, and we talked in Spanish some percentage of the time, so I knew if he started in Spanish, I would speak Spanish. But this particular cafe, the service seemed not to be particularly good, because as we sat there chatting, no one ever came to the table for 20 minutes or something, until finally the cook came out and said we would have to leave. And my grandfather, this was his idea of fun, took me outside and helped me spell out "No Mexicans Allowed" on the sign in the window. Imagine that occurring even in Oklahoma today, right? I mean, the world in my lifetime has very much changed its mind. Humanity has very quickly changed its mind about the relationship between different races and ethnicities. And it didn't change its mind because there was a war or a giant genocide in the 1960s or a meteor. We changed our minds. We decided it was wrong the way we were seeing this. Slavery, to some extent, the same. In this country, of course, there was a big war surrounding the abolition of slavery. But, a few decades before our Civil War, slavery was very common across the whole world, and most of the countries of the world abolished it in spite of the fact that there was a huge economic price to be paid when they abolished it, because we decided it was wrong. And so one of the things I believe very deeply in addition to our imaginative capabilities, is our capacity to change our minds about things and the power of changed minds. As an aside, I just was reflecting on this a few minutes ago. I visited for the first time Jefferson's home at Monticello a few weeks ago. Jefferson's home at Monticello is quite impressive, not least for the fact that it's on the very top of a 1,000-foot high mountain. And I realized as we were driving up there that in the west and in the northeast, there are no homes from that era on the top of 1,000-foot high mountains, for the simple fact that you couldn't get water to a house on the top of a 1,000-foot high mountain unless you had slaves. And over the course of his lifetime, I can't remember what they said, he owned something like 700 people. That gave me a notion of how ingrained into American economics slavery was at that time, and what it meant to the lifestyles of a lot of powerful people to suggest that we were going to abolish it. That was no small thing to American culture, but Americans decided it was wrong and that we wouldn't abide it anymore. The world is not free of slavery, and the United States is not free of racism today, but I believe it is much improved just because we had an idea that we should be better.
So I guess one of the part of that is it seems as if in other parts of the country there are many more examples of things that are kind of popping on the front edge of new business economic strategies, new alternatives being developed than what really is going on around here. And I'm wondering if part of it is just a visibility or an accessibility to what's actually possible. People being able to see it.
It may be. I think that might. It seems to me that might be a misconception. Certainly, when we do stories in Mother Earth News and Natural Home and Garden, the Utne Reader, and the other magazines we have that focus on these issues, we find abundant examples all over the country and almost evenly spread. I do actually somewhat resent the attitude of people in places like Massachusetts or California when they ask me, how could you live in Kansas? How could you run your business in Kansas? A few years ago, I really enjoyed the opportunity of saying, well, my governor, a few years ago, of course, especially in places like New York and Massachusetts and California, I enjoyed saying, well, my governor is a moderate Democratic woman. Who's yours? But regardless of all that, no, I find that we have a smaller population base here than some places, but there's a ton of cool stuff going on. A few miles away in Missouri, there's a place called the Dancing Rabbit Cooperative. About 30 people live out there. They don't drive cars at all. They're completely off the grid, and they're living a really pretty groovy lifestyle. We've written about them a few times. There's some folks who are reclaiming silos in the Manhattan area as homes. Both grain silos and a different group of people are reclaiming missile silos as homes. I think that's super cool. As we look across the country, there's pockets of innovation, there's pockets of engagement with these issues. But I don't find that our part of the country is particularly less energetic than any other part. Our self-image, perhaps, is, we seem to sometimes characterize ourselves as being less progressive, but I travel a lot, and I find both enlightenment and ignorance equally spread. That's my experience. Plus, Mother Earth News is here. Nancy, you have a mic there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to ask you, when we in the county and the city here in Douglas County hired a sustainability coordinator, vetting different candidates for that position. Each one was asked to give their own personal definition of what sustainability is. And it was interesting how they struggled to get, you know,
Yeah.
and the one we ended up with was the one who was able to just, in one sentence, say it all. So that's, how do you define, what's your personal kind of definition of sustainability?
Well, you set an awfully high bar there. My definition of sustainability, something is sustainable if you can do it for an indefinite period of time with no visible negative impact on the environment. The note to that is I can think of almost no human activity that meets that standard. It's all contingent upon how many of us there are. It's very frequent that somebody says to me, well, not everybody can drive an SUV. Not if the whole world lived like Americans, well, there wouldn't be any world. You know, there's these little things people rip off. Yeah, sure, everybody can drive an SUV if there's 2 billion of us. There could be 2 billion SUV driving, McMansion living, hot water using people on the planet if we wanted it that way. I think it really limits the power of visualization when you exclude a huge variable. Now, I don't think the world wants 5 billion fewer people. They don't want to go down the road that would lead us there. But sustainability is completely contingent upon the numbers of us. And if the number is too large, there is no sustainable lifestyle and there is no sustainable practice. The idea of sustainability, though, is really useful when you're looking at the value of different technologies. One of the things that I think we've really got all wrong is that in business, we never do a financial analysis with a time horizon longer than a career, for obvious reasons. If you're going to be in part of a big project or a big investment of some kind, it needs to pay off within the frame of your career. But the problem with that is geothermal, which might be the most miraculous, permanent, infinite energy source that we can develop relatively easily, never amortizes in less than 40 or 50 years, so it never passes muster. And people have the gall to say, well, it's completely impractical, it costs too much. Well, it costs too much for 40 or 50 years, and then it costs virtually nothing at all. But all of our financial analyses are done on that time horizon. And so the concept of sustainability, I don't think of it as an absolute, I seldom think of it as an absolute quantity. But the concept, if it could open our minds to the value of permanent, infinite energy sources and how to actually evaluate them against energy we have to drag out of the ground and distribute in trucks, then I think we'd come up with better answers. And so I think the concept is super important, but I don't think of it as an absolute value of any kind. I've never encountered absolute sustainability because, well, you know, the whole meteor question comes in at some point. Yes, sir.
What do you think about what's going on out at the Land Institute in Salina with Wes Jackson and his attempts to convert perennial grasses to wheat? I guess is a simple way of expressing it.
Yeah. So Wes's idea is that we can take the native plants of the prairie and grow them in a way that keeps the prairie healthy permanently and derive nutrition from it. I have no idea if that idea is scientifically or agriculturally sound. I've read skepticism about it, but I've also read his books. I have no idea if it would work. You know, but I do know that it's brilliant. It's brilliant because it sets that standard. It's that kind of vision. He's put the goal, he set the goal at such a high level that all progress made on that slope toward that goal is rapid progress in a positive direction. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that a visionary like Wes Jackson would set the goal at this sort of extraordinary, almost crazy level, because I think he knew that as we make progress toward this very high goal, we're climbing faster than we would if the goal were down here. And I think his work has been infinitely valuable for that, and who knows, maybe we'll pull it off. What do you think about it?
About the same as you do. It's a remarkable goal, and I think he talks about a 100-year project to try to carry it off, and I think they're into about year 40, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I would, you know, if you ever get a chance, I think they have an annual meeting in September every year, and he invites some world-class speakers to come in and talk about some of these issues.
And I've never been, and my wife and I we're close friends with his first wife, and yet we've never met. So that's a very good reminder that I've been remiss. Thank you. And that's another example. That's Salina, for God's sake. You know what I mean? You know, the town that makes Topeka look progressive. Yeah.
I grew up having some similar experiences as a child out on the land, but many of our young adults who are even here today haven't had that opportunity, and so they're not as connected. And do you have any either advice for parents and educators or for them to get involved and to become more passionate and involved in sustainability issues?
Well, obviously they should come help me mix the manure slurry. Any day, kids. You know, the connection, that's a very nice frame. The connection doesn't come so much from extreme experience as it does intimate experience, I think. My early childhood, it was the farming thing, the animals and the manure and that thing. And then later on, I thought that it was, you know, the big vistas of the Rocky Mountains and camping and backpacking, and we had those experiences. Now I've kind of come back around to experiencing it much more through the daily intimate contact. And you know, a lot of people get that daily intimate contact from growing a tomato plant in a container. Or I've always liked that thing we do where we put a couple of toothpicks through an avocado seed and suspend it in the top of a bottle, and then watch the little avocado tree grow up out of it. I mean, that blows my mind. That's so cool. And so I guess I would just recommend that we stay in touch, all of us of all ages, stay in close, intimate touch with nature and the cool stuff it does. And whatever turns you on, you know, in terms of your experience in nature, wherever that is, what particular thing that is, if something just looks cool, sounds cool, feels cool to be part of, jump in there and interact with it, you know. And when I give the example of the avocado seed, I chuckle inside, you know, because it's such a sort of strange little thing, and all you can really do in this climate, I guess you could pot the avocado seed. I don't even know if that works. I've never kept one. I just throw them away after they grow up to a certain size and get unwieldy. But next time I get just as big a kick out of the darn thing, the next time it sprouts. So I think there's something really valuable about that affectionate intimacy. And, you know, I think every kid ought to have a couple of pets that they can borderline abuse and periodically neglect, you know. I think it's a good way to grow awareness. I do. Yes.
There are 10 states that have deposit laws.
Which
No
laws?
Deposits on containers.
Oh, yes, sure.
And only one charges the Great Lake State of Michigan 10 cents.
Right.
What would you envision if the entire country implemented 10 cents on beverage containers?
You mean after the war, right? Because there will be. I mean, it's every time. I can't believe it's controversial, but it is so controversial every time it comes up. Well, I would envision a dramatic lightening of the load on our landfills. I would imagine a dramatic decrease in the amount of plastic being freely distributed across the globe. You know, plastic detritus is becoming a kind of major environmental issue, which is such a, yeah, well, and it's such a repellent notion, you know. But we're just leaving big piles of plastic all over the place. It's really too bad. And it would make a huge difference. I am personally, though, very reluctant to advocate laws or to push for laws that would change people's behavior. Just because, what did somebody ask me about this morning that seemed like such a good example of this? Oh, the Chinese policy of one child per family, right? Yeah, I talk about population a lot. People get really angry when I do, some people. I always get a letter. Almost every time I write about it, I get at least one letter from somebody who says, well, which one of my 4 children should I kill? I never really felt I was advocating that, but I am always tempted to write back and say, well, tell me a little more about your kids. But I think the Chinese law, I mean, for one thing, the Chinese are very different than us. I mean, they're much more respectful of authority. But the Chinese law has given people who are opposed to the conversation about human population, it's given them this huge club they go around beating on people like me with. The assumption is, if I say that we need to think about human population growth, the assumption is that I'm in favor of the government limiting reproductive rights, which I'm not. I don't think that would necessarily work anyway. I'm in favor of people thinking and talking about it. I'm in favor of giving humanity the chance, and by the way, I think of humanity as, on the whole, a really smart organism. I believe in giving humanity the chance to recognize what we're dealing with and make wise decisions. And every time that government gets ahead of one of these issues, it creates ambient antagonism in the political environment that in the long run may be destructive. I think the fact that we allowed ourselves to push legislation harder than we pushed cultural change in the early days of the environmental movement actually did us a lot of harm in the long run. And furthermore, I think if we'd been studying cultural change, if we'd been studying what we needed to know to persuasively talk to other people all this time, and had been much more persuasive and less inclined to getting on our high horse and speaking from some kind of sense of moral superiority, I don't think we would have elected Ronald Reagan. I think Ronald Reagan was elected because people thought we were a drag, those of us who were strong environmentalists at the time. I mean, he made tons of progress simply by being against environmentalists. And how tragic is that? So the Dutch word for tree hugger is a Dutch word I can't pronounce that means goat hair sock wearing person. As long as we're popularly perceived as the goat hair sock wearing people, we're going to be less effective than we need to be as leaders, I think. And so I'm very critical of the movement I've been a part of since I was a young man, for not being sufficiently persuasive, in not being sufficiently joyful, in not being sufficiently positive for all these 40 years I've been associated with it. Because I think we've done ourselves and the planet a disservice. And so for that, as part of that reasoning, I'm fairly reluctant to try to become a strong public advocate for any particular kind of legislation, because my feeling is if I can persuade 1 million people to feel it without putting it in the context of a raging political debate, then when the idea rises, then the force of those people will take it over the parapet. And governments and big businesses turn on a dime when voters and consumers change their minds. You know, it's not big business's fault. Big business is a big, stupid, impressionable thing. And when consumers say they want something different, big business can move fast. And we just haven't convinced enough people that we want things to be done differently than they've been done historically. That's my take. And of course, it's also my business. That's how I've chosen to go about this thing. Hey, how are you?
Great. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
I think many people come from, or everyone comes from a different background, and we always can't relate to each other on the same, or having come from the same background. You made the point several times that you've reached people through different understandings, whether it be through efficiency or discussions of frugality or the wilderness. And I think no one really likes being preached to, and so and I think often that happens because there's an impasse. You're trying to talk about something that you're interested in, and they're on a different wavelength. So what advice can you give people on trying to diversify their toolbox, so to speak, to be able to communicate and have discussions and lead by examples in more than one of these areas? For example, I feel like I can relate to people plenty on issues of wilderness or efficiency, but I don't have much to say or much background in areas of finance or economy or frugality. So what sort of advice would you give to people on that?
That's the single best question I've been asked maybe ever in a public setting. That's a great question. And the answer I would give is first hone your listening skills. Carolyn thinks that this is sadistic on my part, but I don't think it's sadistic. But on airplanes, I like to ask people a couple of questions about themselves and see how far they will fly before they ask a question in return. And for the vast majority of people, it's an infinitely long flight. If you can ask just a couple of questions, insightful questions about their lives, most people will talk about themselves forever. In the context of what they tell you about themselves, I was on the plane recently with a guy who makes sausage. He works for a big sausage company, and he's fascinated with the process of making sausage. Fascinated, passionate about it, and somewhat resentful of people who suggest that there is something unenlightened about sausage. But by the end of the flight, we're having this fascinating conversation about the ways of making the meat business more friendlier to the earth, more sustainable, more popular with larger audiences. You know, the entree to most people's interests is their self-interest. And regardless of how the sausage dude feels about tree huggers in general, he would like them to buy a lot more sausage. And so we really had a pretty interesting and pretty useful conversation about grass-fed meats and about nitrites and nitrates, and it was pretty cool. And I learned a bunch of stuff I didn't know, and I think, and by the end of it, he was wanting to, he's told me he would subscribe to Mother Earth News. I mean, that's like saying, that's like hearing that she'll call you back after she's done with her paper. But I think listening is the big thing. Because everybody, a lot of what you hear in the conversation, for me anyway, a lot of it seems to be language. a lot of it just seems to be, it's not that we disagree about what we want. You know, the simple stuff I was talking about, clean air, clean water, prosperity, healthy children. Everybody wants that stuff. But there are all these, it's a minefield when you're talking about it, and you probably realize this. You say this word or that word, you say climate change, there's a group of people shut down. You say conservation, there's a group of people that shut down. You say wilderness. I've been accosted once or twice this year by people who wanted to argue with me about the necessity of wilderness. And usually it's people who wanted to do something in a wilderness, drive an ATV or graze cattle or something they weren't allowed to do. So they had a personal reason for having a hot button there. So a lot of times I think it's just the vernacular, and listening, you kind of learn where they're at in their frame, and they give you every opportunity to talk about something that you do know about, that you can be passionate and joyful about. And then for me, that's the key thing. If you're not passionate about finance, well, why the heck? Somebody else talk about finance. If you are passionate about wilderness, then figure out why this person might like wilderness. Maybe they're a hunter, maybe they're a fisherman. Maybe they would enjoy hearing about the native cutthroat trout that you caught, or, you know, who knows. But I think it's first listening, and you know, the people who, we have about 4 million readers of the print magazine, Mother Earth News. We have about, we're just about to hit 2 million unique visitors to the website each month. And in our correspondence, or when we survey, we find that a very high percentage of them, something approaching 30% of them, do not self-identify as environmentalists. You know? So does that mean that they're not in favor of a clean environment? Does that mean they're not interested in sustainability? Does that mean they're not interested in solar or wind or grass-fed or in small agriculture? No, they're obviously interested in all of that, or they wouldn't be sending us checks. It means that the word environmentalist has some kind of tribal content, and they don't believe they're a member of that tribe. And so we try to say environmentalist very seldom. We try to say concern for the environment very seldom. We don't use the word green very often. We try to talk about clean air, clean water, healthy kids, you know, the universal stuff. And most of the time it seems to work pretty good. Is that an answer to your very good question? I think that was a mediocre answer to a very good question, but I'm going to keep working on it. Yes, sir.
How can we teach this stuff to the kids?
Oh. Well, having raised 2 confirmed urbanites, I may not be the guy to ask, you know. At least at this point in their lives. They've left the farm far behind. How can we teach it to the kids? I know that watching my dad have a great time on a fishing trip, just being out in it, was a huge source of inspiration for me. It wasn't particularly the fishing. It was the fact that I could see him experiencing great joy. I think kids are really impressed when they see adults having a very good time. And I think we make a big mistake not letting kids see us have a very good time. Getting all carried away over a funny grasshopper we found, or, you know, a bird we shot, I don't know. Whatever it is that you experience, the experience through which you experience nature joyfully is something that a lot of young people could probably tap into, whatever your particular conduit is. I mean, for God's sake, my conduit was a 55-gallon drum full of liquefied chicken shit. So the conduit is probably less important than your own enthusiasm. That'd be my reaction. I know that John McGrew here in town has made virtually a full-time job out of figuring out ways of connecting young people to nature. And he had Richard Louv in this room just about a month ago or so talking about that. Richard's book is The Last Child in the Woods. That's his last book, I think. Oh, I'm sorry. And the Nature Principle is his last one. Last Child in the Woods was before that. Okay. But anyway, Richard writes about this stuff, getting kids in touch all the time. And for John, it's a full-time passion. So if you wanted to be actively involved with a program, John's program is called outside for a better inside. Do I have that right? And talk about a guy who's sharing the joy. Be warned, set aside plenty of time, because when you get him wound up, you're going to be there for a while. But he's doing a lot of good right here in Lawrence.
And his passion?
John?
Yeah.
I don't know. Is John a hunter? I have no idea.
I know him somewhat, but I don't know for sure.
I know he's an avid fisherman. He has
Yeah,
a home
yeah.
in Montana and goes trout fishing extensively. He trout fishes a lot.
Yeah.
So I know he's an active fisherman. I don't know if he shoots stuff or not. Well, it's been fun for me.